Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the second half of the Ghost Rider effect with After Effects and Element 3D. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, there's going to be a link down in the description below, so be sure to go check that out, get yourself all caught up. But picking up where we left off, the first thing we're going to do is create the blisters on our actor's face, followed by some of the cool glowing edges, and then finally using Element 3D to put in the skull and spine model. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So here we are in Adobe After Effects. As you can see where we last left off, we have our actor's head disappearing in an interesting way and leaving behind a hole where the rest of his body should be. So as I mentioned, the first thing we're going to do is create the blisters. So if you guys remember, we created this composition called Head Matte, and essentially what it's doing is creating a luminance matte that we can use to get rid of our actor's head in an interesting way. However, we're going to be able to use this to create the blisters. So the first thing we need to do is up here in the project panel, find Head Matte, and we're going to duplicate it. So we now have a Head Matte 2. And all we need from this is the Element 3D layer as well as our texture and the camera as well. So go ahead and delete everything except for those. There we go. I'm going to toggle off the transparent background so you can better see what's going on. We just have this head model, which looks pretty interesting. We're now going to use the luminance values from the head to generate the blisters. However, we don't want them to be generated in the exact same place and shape that the holes are, otherwise it wouldn't show up. So for that, we're going to need a new texture. So find our texture composition in the project panel and open it up. And you can see what it is it's just fractal noise that's going from black completely to white. We're going to need to change that a little bit, so let's go ahead and grab it in the project panel, and same as the head matte, let's duplicate it so we now have a texture 2. Double click to open that one up, and what I want to have happen is much quicker, it get almost completely white, but not quite, so I'm going to drag this keyframe for brightness forward. And then under the effects controls, turn the brightness down to something pretty low, maybe say about -5. And then let's go forward to about 3/4 of the way through the composition and turn it back down so it's completely black. So if we play this back, it goes from black to this interesting texture and then back down again. And in order to change up the variety, I'm going to turn the evolution just a little bit and turn up the complexity as well. Now back here in our Head Matte 2 composition, I want to go to the project panel and drag in texture 2. Now click on our Element 3D layer and go to the effects controls. And under custom layers, custom texture maps, we're going to change layer 1 from texture to texture 2. Now I want to shut off texture 2 so it's not visible. And what we're left with is this new head matte that we can use to generate some interesting blisters. So now let's go back into our main composition where everything is going on. And I'm going to grab our footage layer and duplicate it. Now turn the track matte back to no track matte, and then I'm going to pre-compose it. And make sure to click Move All Attributes into New Composition, and click OK. Now double click to open up this new comp, and I'm actually going to rename it really quick. So right click, Composition Settings, and I'm going to call this Skin Blisters. Now navigate to the project panel and find Head Matte 2, drag that in. Now next we're going to create a new adjustment layer. So let's go Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Or you can always hit Control-Alt-Y to bring that in quicker. And I really recommend just spending some time memorizing the shortcuts for things you do regularly in After Effects. Once you start nailing them down, it really speeds up your workflow. And to be honest, there's no reason to be wasting your precious minutes navigating the menu of your favorite compositing software when you could be spending it catching up on all the great TV there is out there, like Game of Thrones. Now next what you're going to want to do is move the adjustment layer below the head matte layer and set it to Luma Matte. Now what this is going to do is only make adjustments to the footage layer below it based on where the bright values of our head matte is. So shut that back off. I'm going to add a curves adjustment to our adjustment layer. And I'm going to darken it down just a touch, and you can already see what that's doing. So let's make this a little bit red. So I'm going to add a little bit of a curve here on the green, add a bit more red in, and let's pull out some blue as well, make it a little bit more orange. That looks pretty cool. So now I'm actually going to add another new adjustment layer. So Control-Alt-Y, and I'm going to add CC Glass to this. It kind of makes our actor look like he's suspicious about something. So he's like, I trust you, or do I? So with CC Glass turned back on, let's go to the surface settings, and I'm going to change the bump map surface to our head matte. And make sure the property is set to lightness or luminance, both of them work similarly. And then we're going to turn down the height. Set it to something maybe about -5. And then let's turn the softness down. And then you can really see what this is doing. Those are some disgusting looking blisters. I'm going to leave the softness sitting somewhere around 3, and then the height to about -3. And now let's go down to the shading, and I'm going to turn the specular down about halfway from where it already is. I want these blisters to be shiny just a little bit, so it almost looks like the skin beneath is a little bit moist. Sorry, that's gross. Let me choose a different word. It's a little bit wet. I backed myself into a corner. I don't know what adjective to use, but you guys get what I mean. And then we can also play with the metal setting as well. So I'm going to turn that down just so I get a little bit more highlight. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go back to the first adjustment layer, and I want it to be a little bit more red. And maybe a little bit darker as well. And I'm going to turn down the opacity on that one as well. So that looks pretty stinking cool. So now let's go back over into our main composition, and our skin blisters, let's put that above everything else. However, the issue is that it's now blocking everything below it. So in order to fix that, we're going to go to the project panel, drag in another instance of Head Matte 2, and then set these skin blisters to Luma Matte. And now what you're left with is a head that has some blisters on it, and the holes are taking over. However, if you look, the blisters are actually up in the hair, and we don't want that. So there's 2 ways to fix that. You can either grab the head matte comp and draw a mask around where it is that you do want your blisters to show up, so you can get it more precise. Maybe you don't want them on the nose. Maybe you just want them down here on the cheek. So that would be a good way of controlling that. Or, I'm going to delete that mask really quick. What I did in the original is I just grabbed these two, the skin blisters and the head matte. I hit Control-Shift-C for pre-compose, and I named this blisters. And then you can come up here and find our hair comp. And now we created this back in part 1, but essentially what we did is we just kind of roughly rotoscoped out our hair. So let's go back in, drag hair comp in above blisters, and then set the blisters to alpha inverted. So now the blisters are only visible where our hair isn't. Except there's a bit of a harsh edge that I don't like, so I'm going to add a box blur to the hair comp. And just turn that up, and that looks pretty good. There we go. Now we have some disgusting blisters showing up on our actor's face. Moving on, now we get to create the cool glowing edges that helps really sell the effect of the head kind of disintegrating as the flesh burns away. That was a disgusting sentence, so let's get right into it. I'm going to grab our footage layer down here, and same as we did before, let's duplicate it, Control-D. I'm going to move it below everything and then change the track matte to none. Now hit Control-Shift-C to pre-compose it, move all attributes, and I'm going to call this glowing edges. Double click on that to open it up. And now we're going to grab the original head matte composition, the first one, not the new one we created, and drag that into this glowing edges composition. We can shut it off for now. Now next is the part that I've been avoiding telling you guys for all of part 1 and so far in part 2, but we can't avoid it any longer. We're going to have to completely rotoscope out our actor's head and neck area. So grab our footage, let's double click on it, and let's grab our rotobrush tool here at the top, and let's go to the first frame, and I'm going to draw around his hair. It's okay if the outside edge isn't perfect on the hair. The main thing we're concerned about is making sure we get all of his skin and we don't get any of his jacket down here. We don't want any of that. Now next, we're gonna have to go through the entire length of our effect and adjust this as needed. So I'm going to drag this out so that way we can roto the whole length and frame by frame make adjustments as needed. Hey, look at that. That wasn't even close to as bad as I thought it was going to be. So once you're confident you have your roto job done well and you don't need to make any further adjustments, a good tip before moving on is to click this freeze button. Now back here in our glowing edges composition, since our roto is done, we can click our head mat and turn it back on and set the track mat to alpha. So now our head mat is only visible where our actor's head is. Now next we're going to add a new adjustment layer, Control-Alt-Y, as we discussed earlier, and I'm going to add a Luma key to this adjustment layer. Make sure you've moved it to the top as well. Now for this Luma key, I'm going to change the key type to Key Out Brighter. And since the black is pure black and the white is pure white, you shouldn't have to adjust any settings. You should just be good with this weird kind of rough black outline. Now let's select everything inside of this glowing edges composition, hit Control-Shift-C to pre-compose, and I'm going to name this the glow mat. Now we can select our glow mat, Control-D to duplicate it, and I'm going to set the bottom one, the track mat, to alpha inverted mat. So if you've done everything correctly up to this point, there should be absolutely nothing in your composition, which, believe it or not, is what we want. So select the bottom copy, and we're going to add a turbulent displace effect to it. Now what this is doing is it's kind of warping the shape that we've created around, so that way in the places where it doesn't perfectly line up with its top copy, it's visible. So I want to turn the size down just a touch, maybe about 20 should be good, and then play with the amount until you have some edges that you think look pretty cool. Now, a small tip I'll give you is that if you think that these edges aren't thick enough and you want them to show up even more than they already are, go to your top copy of Glow Matte and add a matte choker effect to it. Now, you can turn the choke up all the way to 127, and if you need it to go beyond that, you can just duplicate the matte choker effect. However, I think its default 75 on the top copy gives some nice thick edges that are going to work perfectly for our situation. Now next what I want to do is grab our bottom copy, the one that has turbulent displace on it already, and I'm going to add a fractal noise to it. Now what this is going to do is just kind of break up that pure black and introduce a lot of values of gray. I'm going to turn the brightness up just a touch, and that looks pretty good for now. Now next, add another new adjustment layer to the top of all of this. Now to this adjustment layer, I'm going to add a solid composite effect. Change the background color to be black, and then we can add a tint effect if we want, and change the white to be something in the orange value. There, you might be able to see where this is going. Now next, we can add on maybe some color vibrance from Video Copilot. Change that to somewhere close to orangish red. We can go back and adjust this later if need be. Now I'm going to add 2 instances of glow. The first one is going to have the threshold fairly low and the radius pretty low as well. Just going to create those hot edges. That looks pretty cool. Now next I'm going to duplicate that glow, turn the threshold up some, and then expand the glow quite a bit. And if you want, you can go even further as to duplicate the glow a 3rd time, turn the threshold up even more, and expand the glow even more than it already is. Alright, so that's looking pretty cool so far, but there is an issue that I need to address before we move any further. The edges of our mat are always glowing, which is absolutely not what we want. So the easiest way I found to fix that is to go ahead and just grab our bottom copy of Glow Matte and draw a mask around the parts that you do want to keep, getting rid of those always glowing edges. And it's okay if it's not perfect, just kind of roughly go around the shape you want. I'm going to add a little bit of a feather to this, and then hit M on the keyboard to bring up the mask path options. And we're going to keyframe this so that way the edges stay mostly invisible for where you need them to. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now don't forget to save your project every once in a while. You'd hate for your cat or your dog to go lay down on your power strip, and because you're too cheap to invest in some sort of temporary battery to keep your computer running, your your project is gone. I'm not speaking from experience or anything. Now, before moving on, I kind of am looking at this now and thinking it looks a little bit too vibrant. So go back up to color vibrance and change that vibrance value down to about 0.5. And also, I'm going to make the color a little bit more red. That looks pretty cool. And lastly, before all of our instances of glow, I'm going to collapse those just to make it a bit easier. I'm going to add another effect called box blur. So just drag that above your glow, and I'm going to change this to say about 0.5. That looks pretty cool. We might need to go back and adjust some of these settings later, but for now it's looking pretty good. So back over here in our main composition, we can grab our glowing edges and move it to the very top of everything, making sure to not accidentally put it in between the blisters and hair comp. Now we can go ahead and set its transfer mode to screen. And there we go, we got some glowing edges on our actor's face, and it's looking pretty good so far, I think. So the last big step to completing this effect is, of course, our skull. So in order to do that, we need to grab our head matte in the project panel, head matte 2 actually, and we're gonna duplicate that one more time. So now we have head matte 3, so let's go into there. And we can actually delete these two textures just to get rid of some of the clutter. Select your Element 3D layer, and then under the effects controls, go to the scene setup. Now here in the scene setup, you will see the import button in the top left corner. So I'm going to use that to navigate to the skull model of choice. Now this one that I will be using is from turbosquid.com. I think it cost about $2. However, you'll notice that in the original example, I actually was using the free one from Video Copilot's Halloween pack. So here it is over here already installed. I really like this model. However, I think it was more intended for a motion graphics type of scenario due to its proportions and the textures. However, it'll work just fine for you guys if you don't feel like spending any money. So once you have your skull model imported, the first thing you need to do is line it up to your head so it fits realistically inside. So I need to rotate this 90 degrees, let's scale it down just a touch, and scoot it back, move it up. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I think that that looks pretty good. Now you can go ahead and delete your male head and sphere model, and what you're left with is the skull. Now before we exit out, we actually need to add a texture to this. So I have Pro Shaders 2 here. Now there's a really cool texture in the plaster pack that I like. Down here at the bottom, Plaster White 02. And I'm going to turn off draft textures so I can see a bit better, and I think that that looks really good with our skull model. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now if you scrub through, you can see that that same tracking that was applied to our head matte is now automatically already applied to our skull. So I'm going to leave this composition for now, knowing that we might need to come back and adjust later, and go back to our main comp. In the project window, navigate to head matte 3, and let's drag that down just above our collar composition. And already that seems to line up pretty well. So let's go ahead and go back into the composition with our skull in it, and I'm going to add a spotlight. So go Layer, New, choose Light, and then change the light type to Spot. The color I'm going to make to a slightly orangish yellow tungsten color to match what was happening outside on my front porch. The rest of the settings we can change around later if we feel is necessary. Now I'm going to move my light almost to be directly head on with my skull and a little bit above it as well. Now here in the Element 3D render settings, we can find shadows and then click Enable. I also want to go ahead and enable ambient occlusion while we're at it, and then turn up that value quite a bit. Now the next thing I want to do is go back over into our main composition and grab our footage layer and hit Ctrl+C to copy it, go back over into head matte and paste. Now I need to toggle the switches down here and change the track matte back to none, and I'm going to put this at the bottom below our element layer, and then right click, choose guide layer. Now, what a guide layer does, if you don't know, is it essentially just makes it so it only shows up in the composition that it is present in. So, though it is visible in this comp, when we head back over into where the comp is nested, the footage doesn't come with it, just the skull. So that's a really handy technique for when you need a layer visible only for reference. Now what I want to do is add a levels adjustment to our Element 3D layer. Now I'm going to change this window to only show us the red channel, and then I'm going to change my levels so that way I'm only editing the red channel as well. I'm going to match those tones as best as I can, then switch both to green, then switch both to blue. Okay, and now we can switch the preview window back to RGB. Now I also want to add a box blur to our Element 3D layer, and I want to give it a radius of about 0.4. And then I'm going to add some grain with the add grain effect, change preview to final output, and the intensity down to about 0.5. And then I'm going to turn on the motion blur for Element 3D and the composition. I'm thinking we're going to need to darken it down some and remove a little bit of contrast. So go back to our levels. Let's switch the channel back to RGB, and I'm going to darken it down just a touch, and then pull out some of the contrast. There we go. I'm really liking how that looks right now. Now the last thing I want to do before we can go add the finishing touches onto this is add our spine model. So to do that, we can go to the project window. Let's find our head mat and duplicate that one final time so we have a head mat 4. And just to make it easy, I want to go to head mat 3 and I'm going to rename this to skull. And then I want to go to head mat 4 and I'm going to rename this one to spine. Now inside of the spine composition, the first thing we need to do is get rid of all of our keyframes from the head control null and our 3D camera track. So let's go to the very first frame and hit U on the keyboard with our 3D camera selected, and then click the blue stopwatch for both of our values to get rid of those keyframes. And let's do the same thing for head control. Click it, hit U, and then click our blue stopwatches to get rid of our keyframes. And so what we're left with is a skull that is completely stationary, but we're going to be switching this skull out with our spine model. So let's go to the Element 3D scene setup to do that. Now here in the scene setup, we need to import our vertebrae model, which came with the resources pack you may have downloaded in part 1. If you haven't done that, the link to download that is in the description of this part as well, so go ahead and do that. So let's click import, navigate to the vertebrae model, and then click open. Click OK. Now I'm going to move this out to the side so we can see it without disturbing our skull model, and you can see that the orientation is a little bit weird. So let's go ahead and zoom in on that so we can fix it. I'm going to rotate it this way, then back up a touch, and back this way, and it appears to be just about level. There we go. Now we need to duplicate this probably 7 or 8 times so that way we have ourselves a completed spine. Leave yourself a tiny gap in between each instance of the spine so that way it creates some cool shadows. I'm not a surgeon or anything like that, but I think that the discs between the spine may have burned away in this instance, so the tiny gap will do just fine. So once you have your stack of vertebrae models all set the way you like it and you think it looks good, create a new folder, and let's put all of them inside of it so we can control them all as a group. I'm going to rename this group to vertebrae. And let's select this option right here to move the anchor point back over to where it lines up with the vertebrae. Now we can turn that off, move the vertebrae down, and let's line it up similarly to how we did with the head versus the skull model. We need to add in our vertebrae so that way it would sit accurately with how the skull would be. Scale it up some, move it down. Now I'm going to shut off the visibility of our skull and add the texture that we used for the skull, which was the plaster white 02, to the vertebrae group. And I need to make sure to click these vertebrae models and set the UV mapping from UV to box. And we should have done that before duplicating them, so just go through and change them all to box now. And once that's done, we should be ready to click OK. Now let's click on our head control and turn our vertebrae model so that way it lines up with the shoulders fairly accurately. It doesn't have to be perfect. There we go, that looks good. Now I'm going to go back into our main composition where we've been doing everything else. and go to the project window and find the spine composition. I'm going to drag that in below our skull, but still above our collar composition. Now I'm going to move this down into the left so it lines up with the empty hole where our actor's head used to be. And once you're happy with its positioning, go ahead and parent it to our knoll that we created back in part 1 that is tracking to our actor's shoulders. Now the next thing we need to do is make it so that way our spine doesn't go over the neck of the actor's shirt right here. So the easy way to do that would be to navigate to our glow mat comp where our rotoscope of our actor was, and just hit Control-C and copy that, go back over, hit paste, and then set our spine to be alpha matte. So I think our spine is looking a little bit bright, so I'm gonna add a curves adjustment to that and just bring down the brightness just a touch. That looks good. And now I want to toggle the switches and turn on the motion blur for our spine. All right, and with that, this is what you're left with. You have the cool blisters, the glowing edges, and the skull and spine models composited in. And in my opinion, it's all looking pretty good so far. As you can probably tell, this is not your final effect yet. I just wanted to share with you guys the big steps involved in creating this Ghost Rider effect, and I think we've done that, so I'm confident you guys can take it the rest of the way there on your own. The last thing to do that I did in the original was I tracked the eyes and I added some cool glow in there. Obviously, remove the tracker markers from your actor's face if you added some. Definitely don't forget to composite some fire stock footage in there. There are a lot of great tutorials out there for doing that, so I'm not going to delve into that for this particular one, but maybe I'll touch on it in a future tutorial. And then the last couple things are, in the original I added some cool subsurface glow that Andrew Kramer from Video Copilot has an amazing tutorial for doing. I'm going to put a link down in the description below that I highly recommend you guys check out if you want to enhance this effect even further or just learn that technique. And then maybe some heat distortion, some color correction, and the obligatory letterbox to make it look like a movie, and you're done. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. The YouTube comments are a great place to reach me. Twitter as well. I'm always on there replying to people, so don't be afraid to ask me any questions or share your final results with me. I love seeing them. And as always, don't forget to leave a like if you learned something, and consider subscribing.